Mom and Dad should leave that house. Tonight, my son said it right there on his wedding stage, in front of hundreds of guests and dozens of phones recording everything. People thought it was an awkward joke. I didn't, because in his hand was a contract, and in my daughter-in-law's eyes was the calm certainty of someone who believed everything was already under control. They didn't know that in that exact moment, they had just slammed shut their own final door. Before I go on, if you're listening to this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I want to know. Because stories like this don't only happen in Oakwood. They happen in many families. And now, let me tell you how it all began. The ceremony was held beneath the old oak trees of Oakwood, the place where I planted the very first fences with my own hands more than 30 years ago. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through the leaves, falling softly onto rows of white chairs lined up in perfect order. Gentle music played in the background, just loud enough to cover the whispers and polite laughter. Margaret and I were seated in the front row, right beside the aisle. People looked at us with that familiar respect, as if we were still the owners of this land. At least that's what they believed. I remember exactly how I felt in that moment. Not proud, not emotional, just a long, steady quiet. The kind that comes when you've lived long enough to know that peaceful moments are often a warning, that something is about to break. Margaret held my hand, squeezing it lightly out of habit. She smiled at the guests, smiled at our son standing at the end of the aisle wearing a well-fitted suit, carrying more confidence than he truly needed. Andrew looked nothing like the boy who once ran around this property with mud on his shoes. Now he walked slowly, his eyes sweeping over the guests as if he were taking inventory. When the host invited him to speak, the crowd fell silent. I heard a few whispers filled with anticipation. Everyone assumed this was the part where he thanked his parents. The part people like me listen to quietly, then nod and move on. Andrew took the microphone and cleared his throat. He didn't look at me right away. He looked to Taylor first, as if seeking confirmation. She stood beside him in her spotless white dress, her phone already open in her hand. I noticed the tiny glow on the screen, but I said nothing. These days, every moment can become content. "The party today is wonderful," Andrew said, his voice steady, not a trace of nerves. "But there's something that needs to be said plainly." I felt Margaret stiffen slightly. I didn't. I had heard enough openings like that in my life. In boardrooms, on factory floors, in negotiations, where someone was about to ask for more than they deserved. Andrew turned fully toward us. The smile disappeared from his face, replaced by a cold seriousness. "Dad." "Mom," he said slowly, like he was reading from a prepared statement. "It's time for you to leave Oakwood. I've signed a contract to sell the entire property. Tonight you should start packing." There was no background music, no awkward laughter, just silence, heavy dropping over the crowd like a thick curtain. I could hear someone inhale sharply, a chair shifting. A few people turned to look at me, waiting for a reaction. Maybe they expected me to stand up to protest loudly, or at least show the confusion of a father put on the spot. Margaret turned to me. In her eyes, I saw shock, and a question she didn't dare speak. I didn't answer. I simply set my glass down on the small table beside me. The movement was slow and deliberate, as if I were reminding myself that this was not a place for emotion. By then, Taylor had raised her phone higher. I could clearly see the screen pointed straight at us. I knew my face was being broadcast somewhere, along with captions I didn't need to read to understand. To her, this wasn't just a wedding. This was a stage. Andrew kept talking. He explained that selling the land was the best decision for the future, that Oakwood was outdated and no longer suitable. He used smooth words, the same kind a broker uses when persuading someone to give up what they've spent a lifetime holding on to. He didn't mention asking for our opinion. He spoke as if everything had already been settled. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I looked straight at my son, searching for the boy who once asked me how to fix a door that wouldn't close properly. The man standing in front of me was someone else now. Someone who believed a signature on paper mattered more than the years spent building this place. When Andrew finished, the crowd remained silent. No applause, no laughter. I stood up, not out of anger, but because I understood that if I stayed seated, things would slide in a direction I could no longer control. I took one step forward, just enough for Andrew to see me clearly. My voice wasn't loud, but I knew it carried. "Andrew," I said, "you've just made a mistake that someone in your line of work should never make." I didn't explain further. I didn't need to. Some sentences don't require what comes next, because what comes next will find its own way. I returned to my seat beside Margaret. This time she held my hand tighter. The ceremony continued, as if nothing had happened. But for me, in that exact moment, I knew something had broken. And I also knew this. Some mistakes once spoken in front of a crowd can never be taken back. After the ceremony, Oakwood fell into a strange kind of silence. The guests left faster than expected. Cars lined up and disappeared down the red dirt road leading out of the property. Margaret and I walked back to the main house as dusk settled in. We didn't say a word to each other. Some things right after they happen, if you speak too soon, they shatter in ways that can never be repaired. That night, Margaret didn't sleep. I knew it, even though she never said a thing. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring into the empty space in front of her. Oakwood was never just land. It was where we raised our son, where my father taught me how to measure every board by hand, where my mother used to hang laundry in the late afternoon sun. I had believed that no matter what happened, Andrew understood that. Then I remembered an afternoon a few months earlier when Andrew and Taylor came to visit, carrying a thick folder held together with neat clips. They placed it on the dining table right beside the teapot Margaret had just brewed. Andrew talked about a special health coverage program for seniors, something he said would help us feel more secure later on. He spoke quickly, pointing to papers referencing figures. Taylor sat beside him, nodding along, adding comments about how planning early is always better. I wasn't unfamiliar with paperwork. I spent my life as an engineer, surrounded by drawings and contracts. But that day, familiarity dulled my caution. The pages were arranged carefully, the important sections buried inside long, complicated language. Andrew pointed to the places where I needed to sign, saying it was just confirmation to enroll. Margaret looked at me uncertain. I remember saying, "He's our son. He wouldn't do anything to hurt us." I signed. More than once. A few weeks later, a letter arrived at Oakwood. Not from an insurance company, but from a law office. The wording was brief and dry. It spoke of a transfer of ownership by gift. I read it 3 times. The feeling was like noticing a single number placed wrong in a blueprint. Small, but enough to bring the entire structure down. I didn't tell Margaret right away. I needed to be sure I wasn't mistaken. I called an old friend who had worked in the legal field. We met at a small cafe outside town. He reviewed the copies I brought page by page, then looked up at me for a long moment before saying, "Thomas, you signed over the property." I didn't feel angry then. I felt empty, like a machine shutting down, not because of a major failure, but because one small bolt had been quietly removed. The rest of the truth came faster than I expected. Through a few old connections, I learned that Andrew was drowning in debt, risky investments, deals that promised fast returns, and charges without names, the kind Taylor left behind after every trip. The amount, more than $1 million, wasn't rumor. It was right there in the statements I was shown. Oakwood, with its value and its history, was the only escape they could see. That evening I heard arguing from the guest house where Andrew and Taylor were staying. They didn't know I was outside checking the lighting system. Taylor's voice came first, sharp, urgent, talking about time, pressure, about how they couldn't wait any longer. Andrew answered, his voice lower, filled with worry. Then I heard the sentence that made me stop cold. "Your parents have lived in luxury long enough. Put them somewhere cheap and we can finally take back what should have been ours." I didn't walk in. I didn't confront them. I quietly stepped away carrying my phone, which had recorded every word. Not because I planned to use it right then, but because I needed to remember, so I wouldn't lie to myself ever again. When I told Margaret, she didn't cry at first. She sat for a long time, her hand resting on an old notebook. Then she asked me one simple question. Where did we go wrong? I couldn't answer. Some questions don't have clear replies, only choices that come next. From that moment on, I understood this was no longer just a family matter. This was a carefully prepared performance, and we had just been assigned roles we never asked for. I didn't confront them. I didn't accuse them. I started to watch. Every phone call, every time Andrew mentioned paperwork, every look in Taylor's eyes when she spoke about Oakwood. Piece by piece, it formed a picture I could no longer ignore. The night before the wedding, I stood alone in the field behind the house. Wind moved through the old oak trees, carrying the familiar scent of damp earth. I thought about what had been lost, and what might still be saved. I knew that if I acted too soon, everything would end exactly the way they had planned. And I also knew that if I waited for the right moment, the truth would step into the light on its own. The next morning I put on my old suit and straightened my tie in front of the mirror. Looking at my wrinkled face, I didn't see a betrayed father. I saw someone who finally understood that trust once exploited should never be given back easily. And I stepped outside, ready for the next part of a story I never wanted to tell. After the ceremony, I didn't change my attitude. At least, not on the surface. I still answered Andrew's calls. I still listened as he talked about his future plans with that same confident tone. I even let Taylor call me Dad in front of other people, though every time she did, something felt out of place. They believed I had accepted reality, that I was slowly getting used to the idea of leaving Oakwood. My silence reassured them. In truth, that was when I began working. I started spending more time in my father's old study. The room still held dusty folders and handwritten notes from decades ago. Oakwood wasn't acquired through a simple transaction. It had been built across generations, with clauses most outsiders never noticed. I opened every drawer, turned every yellowed page. Familiar handwriting appeared, reminding me of evenings when my father sat at that desk, explaining why some things must be protected by structure, not trust alone. I called the family attorney. He'd been retired for years, but he remembered Oakwood clearly. We met in a small office with no sign outside, no polished front desk. He read through the papers Andrew had signed, then shook his head. "This property is held in a family trust," he said. "No one can transfer all of it without the consent of the trustees." That was when I finally let out a breath I'd been holding for months. Not full relief, but the knowledge that I still had choices. Oakwood couldn't be taken with a few carefully hidden signatures. I didn't tell Andrew. Instead, I let him believe everything was moving according to his plan. I even suggested I could help clean up the paperwork to make the sale go more smoothly. Andrew seemed grateful. He called me more often, asked for my advice on legal details he once thought he fully understood. I gave him just enough. No more, no less. I let him think I was on his side. At the same time, I reached out to an old friend who now ran a mid-sized real estate investment firm. We didn't talk about feelings. We talked about clauses, procedures, and what a legitimate deal requires. I asked him to play the role of the buyer, a corporation interested in Oakwood for its long-term development value. Everything was arranged quietly. No loose ends. Meanwhile, Taylor began to show herself more openly. She spoke about Oakwood as if it already belonged to her. She changed things in the house without asking Margaret. One afternoon, when I came home earlier than expected, I saw several boxes placed near the fireplace. Inside were Margaret's keepsakes, old photographs, small items she'd saved from her younger years. Taylor stood there saying, "These things just take up space." I said nothing. I watched as she pushed the boxes closer to the fireplace, as if erasing a history she considered unnecessary. Margaret stood behind me, silent. I could feel her hand trembling lightly. In that moment, something inside me closed. No noise, no outburst, just a decision made with complete clarity. From that day on, I didn't hesitate. I began documenting everything. Times, conversations, the way they spoke about Oakwood, about money, about us. Not out of revenge, but because I understood that in their world, truth only matters when it's placed in the right moment. Andrew grew more anxious. The wedding was close. Payments were piling up. He pushed me to sign a few more supplemental documents. I signed, but only papers my attorney had reviewed carefully. Traps within traps, just as my father once taught me. Not to harm others, but to stop them from harming themselves. The night before the wedding, Andrew called me. His voice was tight, though. He tried to stay polite. He asked if I was sure everything was ready. I told him Oakwood was still standing, and that things would become clear soon. He went quiet for a few seconds, then thanked me. I heard the relief in his voice, the sound of someone who believes he's about to clear a major obstacle. I ended the call and remained in my study, looking around the familiar room. These walls had witnessed many hard decisions in my life, but never had the line between family and justice felt this fragile. I didn't want to win. I wanted the truth placed where it belonged. The next morning, as I stepped out of the house to attend the ceremony, Oakwood looked the same as always. The oak trees stood in silence. The fields stretched beneath the early sun. None of the guests about to arrive knew that beneath that calm surface, a structure was already in place, waiting to reveal itself when the time came. I adjusted my jacket and took a deep breath. I knew the hardest part was still ahead, but I also knew this. Once I stepped onto this path, there would be no turning back. Not out of hatred, but because some things, if left hidden, will keep breaking everything, quietly, from the inside. The moment Andrew finished his announcement, the air beneath the oak trees felt compressed, like the second before a heavy door shuts. I felt it clearly. Taylor still held her phone high. Her eyes moved quickly across the crowd, waiting for a reaction. View's approval, something public she could hold on to. I stood up. No one invited me to the stage. But no one stopped me either. Maybe they thought I was about to say something conciliatory, or at least offer the expected response of a father put in an impossible position. I walked slowly, one step at a time, feeling the wooden floor beneath my feet. Each step deliberate. Unrushed, I took the microphone from Andrew's hand. He didn't resist. He looked at me with the confidence of someone who believed every piece was already in place. "I didn't come here to ruin a wedding," I said, my voice low and even. "But since everything's been said in front of everyone, I think a few things should be made clear." I turned to the crowd. Familiar faces, unfamiliar ones, friends, business partners, members of the bride's family. None of them knew they were about to witness a very different story than the one they came for. "The company Andrew says has purchased Oakwood," I continued, "is a firm I know very well, because I'm the one behind it." A ripple moved through the crowd. Andrew spun toward me. The smile vanished from his face. Taylor lowered her phone for a split second, then lifted it even higher, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. I didn't pause. "The contract my son signed," I said, "is not valid. Oakwood is held in a family trust established decades ago. No single individual can transfer the entire property without the consent of the trustees." I looked straight at Andrew. "You knew that. You were just hoping your parents didn't." Andrew opened his mouth, but no words came out. Taylor stepped forward, her voice sharper than before, trying to regain control. She talked about confusion, about misunderstandings, about how everything could be handled later. I raised my hand. "There's one more thing," I said. "This live stream." I signaled to the sound technician. The large screen behind the stage lit up, not with wedding footage, but with a video recorded inside the guest house. A familiar voice filled the air. Clear, unedited. Words about money, about Oakwood, about pushing us out of the life we built. The crowd fell silent. Taylor froze. The phone in her hand was still streaming, but now it wasn't a tool for attention anymore. It had become a mirror reflecting exactly who she was and what she'd said. "I'm not playing this to humiliate anyone," I said. "I'm playing it because the truth shouldn't be hidden behind lights and flowers." Andrew lowered his head. I didn't see instant regret. I saw the collapse of a plan built on misplaced trust. Taylor was different. She scanned the crowd, searching for support from the people watching. No one answered. A few guests quietly stood up. Some looked away. Phones were still recording, and I knew that somewhere people who had worked with Taylor were watching. I didn't need to explain the consequences. They had already begun. In that moment, when messages appeared on her screen, when her practiced smile could no longer hold. Not long after, a few individuals approached from outside the event area. Calm, unhurried. They spoke briefly with the event coordinator, off to the side. I didn't watch them closely. I only knew that from this point on the story was no longer in my family's hands. I returned the microphone to the host. "The ceremony can continue," I said. "If they want it to." No one applauded. No one objected. The wedding went on. But it was no longer truly a ceremony. It felt like a room thrown wide open where everyone understood something could never return to the way it was. I went back to my seat. Margaret took my hand. It no longer trembled. I felt the exhaustion, but also something lighter in that grip, as if a heavy burden had finally been set down. I didn't look at Andrew again. I didn't need to. What needed to be said had been said. What needed to be revealed had been revealed. I knew that from this moment on, every path Andrew and Taylor thought was secure had shifted in a direction they never expected. As the sun dipped behind the trees, the light over Oakwood changed. I sat still, listening to the familiar wind. I felt no sense of victory. Only the calm of someone who understands that sometimes justice doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives by placing the truth exactly where it belongs, in front of everyone. After the ceremony, Oakwood went quiet. No music, no lights. The white chairs were taken away in silence, as if everyone understood the land needed to be returned to itself. Margaret and I didn't stay long. We left before night fully settled, not to avoid anyone, but because we were both exhausted. The days that followed moved slowly. Andrew and Taylor didn't reach out. I didn't look for them either. Everything went through attorneys. Proper channels, proper distance, no arguments, no late-night calls, just paperwork, scheduled meetings, and decisions made quietly. I imagine for Andrew it was the first time he had to face consequences without being able to talk his way out of them. The lavish wedding left behind expenses they believed would be covered quickly. When Oakwood was no longer an escape, those numbers grew heavier than ever. I didn't feel satisfaction hearing that. I felt sad. Sad because things could have been different if they had chosen honesty from the start. Margaret changed more than I expected. She stopped pacing the house the way she used to. One morning, she told me she wanted to walk through the North Field, a place few people ever went. We walked slowly, step by step. She spoke about things she had held on to for too long. Not just keepsakes, but expectations. "I think I loved our child in the easiest way," she said. I didn't argue. Some realizations arrive late, but they still matter. It was Margaret who suggested donating part of Oakwood. She said if the land had once been used as a tool, then maybe it was time for it to become something gentler. We discussed it carefully. No rush. No emotion driving the decision. In the end, we set aside the western section as a bird sanctuary. The old oak trees would remain. No construction. No development. The rest of Oakwood went into a small charitable trust managed by Margaret. She didn't want her name displayed prominently. She simply wanted to help other older people avoid the mistakes we had made. I respected that. I think it was her way of closing a chapter. I saw Andrew one last time during a brief meeting when everything was nearly finished. He looked nothing like he did on the wedding day. The polished image was gone. Just a young man, tired, trying to stay composed. He didn't meet my eyes at first. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I remembered. "I thought you'd leave everything to me," he said. "I once thought so too," I replied. "But leaving something and having it taken are not the same." He stayed silent for a long time. I didn't explain further. I didn't talk about morals or responsibility. Some lessons only arrive when there's nothing left to lean on. Before I left, I said one last thing. Not to accuse him, but to end it. "I was prepared for Oakwood to be in your inheritance," I said. "But you chose to take it while your parents were still here. When you chose money over family, you didn't just lose a piece of land." Andrew nodded, very slightly. I don't know if he fully understood, but I knew I had said all I could. In the afternoons that followed, Margaret and I often sat on the porch looking out over the fields. No tense calls, no papers hidden in drawers. We talked about small things, the weather, the birds, trips we had always postponed. For the first time in many years, the future no longer felt like a burden that needed calculating. I turned 70 with an unfamiliar feeling. Not loss, but freedom. Oakwood was still there, but it no longer held us hostage with the fear of betrayal. It became part of life, not the center of every decision. If someone asks me whether a child's betrayal is the end, I say no. It's a final test. A test of whether parents dare to hold on to their dignity. Margaret and I chose to stand steady, not to defeat anyone, but to keep living a peaceful life, even when things didn't unfold the way we once hoped. Thank you for staying until the final moments of this story. If it made you think, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it, so others have the chance to listen and protect themselves before it's too late. This story isn't meant to condemn anyone. It's a reminder that family only has meaning when it's built on honesty and respect. Money can make many things easier, but it can also break the strongest relationships. And you, if you had to choose between staying silent for peace or speaking the truth to protect your dignity, what would you choose? Let me know. I'll see you again in the next story.